The left is always inclined to look on the grim side of things. Always inclined to look on the grim side of things. The cup is always half empty. Until you point out, look, it's half full. It doesn't look so bad.
Welcome to Political Gingervitis, the crazy and zany podcast for progressives who need a laugh. I'm your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and this week we're going to try to put a smile on your face and maybe a few thoughts in your head.
Are you the Judean People's Front? Fuck off. What? Judean People's Front. Well, the People's Front of Judea. Judean People's Front. Wankers.
Welcome again, folks, to another exciting episode of Political Gingervitis. I am your hostess with the mostest, Andrew Stewart, and today we're going to be going through a long and tumultuous and interesting trip across all sorts of discussion topics as we begin to head into February of 2018. Some of you might have recently attended some of the second women's marches held all over the country with the lovely pink pussy hats and cisgendered ethos that included apparently a lot of trans exclusionary radical feminism, which is part and parcel of what you find these days with a lot of mainstream liberal progressives, as the late Alexander Colburn called them. Apparently, Cindy Sheehan, the great and exemplary anti-war protester, raised a real stink because the women's march that she was involved with at one point trying to build a coalition alongside ended up siding with some pretty nasty imperialist aspects of the Democratic Party, which is just par for the course with anything that the progressives are able to come up with these days. As long as they stay beholden to the Democratic Party, they will always remain a imperialist caucus. That's just an unfortunate part of working within the Democratic Party. So we're in some really interesting and strange political coordinates these days. The game show host Cheeto Mussolini president is in the midst of the Mueller investigation, which apparently is looking for Russians under the bed instead of acknowledging the fact that the Democratic Party was given an absolute gift with the ability to run their candidate against a game show host, and they blew it, as we've mentioned previously. And we are also finding ourselves gearing up, it seems, for continued and accelerated standoffs with Russia and China. China, of course, is now in a position where its One Belt, One Road initiative alongside other multi-polar world regional constructs are beginning to materialize in a fashion that very well could see this indeed be the Chinese century. Xi Jinping, the paramount leader of the Chinese Communist Party, is now forever enshrined within the communist system with his own Xi Jinping thought, which is quite an astounding achievement in comparison to his predecessors, there's only been two others who reached that level of recognition within the apparatus of the Communist Party, namely Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping, each of whom had extremely different perspectives on governance of China, no doubt about it. But the fact is that China is accelerating and is in the passing lane, while America is continuing to be crippled by our bizarre political system and our imperial over expenditures that are now consuming more than half of the entire federal discretionary spending budget. So we're going to need a lot of laughs in the years coming forward. And so stick around with Political Gingervitis because we're going to give you some laughs and something to think about. So first off today, we're going to begin with a current events story. We have an interview with Mike Araujo, the director of Rhode Island Jobs with Justice, and he is going to be discussing an upcoming April rally that's going to commemorate the anniversary, 50 years since the death of the great Martin Luther King Jr. We have a major Martin Luther King holiday coming up, and there's a effort to commemorate his birth as well as the anniversary of his assassination in 1968, 50 years ago. So can you describe kind of where this is coming out of?
So one of the things we lose with Martin Luther King, like this is the motivation behind it, is that kind of in the moment we're in right now, we've lost sight of probably the most important parts of Dr. King's message. And like celebrating just his birth, like in January, is great, but it kind of takes him out of the realm of struggle, right? Like the infant Martin Luther King wasn't fighting yet, right? Like he was a little baby, which is wonderful, but it kind of puts him in the realm of like a religious figure. And I don't think that that's necessarily where, ironically, the Reverend King fits in our history or in his moment. And I think a lot of times we forget that his death was like a lacuna moment for our country. It represented, to a lot of folks, the fragility of our movements, fragility of life, but also what he was. Like he was with workers on the line effectively, and he was gunned down in a place where there was active class struggle and racial struggle going on in that service. And I think reclaiming that aspect of Dr. King is sort of was my motivation of sort of bringing people together. And then additionally, over the past few years, especially with the movement for Black Lives, sort of as an emergent political force, we see Dr. King trundled out every time there's a conflict between Black people and white society, that they say Dr. King wouldn't approve of your behavior or whatever. There's a willingness to speak for him without really understanding him. And we want to put a stop to that. We want to say that Dr. King belongs to a radical, militant, aggressive working class movement for liberation.
It strikes me that there's an interesting parallel in terms of the fact that King, when he is assassinated, has been abandoned by liberals and become sort of this pariah figure in that liberal press because of him going after the Vietnam War and taking on structures that went beyond just Southern racism. And it seems like we've seen that recently recurring also, whether it's poo-pooing of people for certain behaviors or certain tactics or anything like that.
Yeah, no, well, right. So and there's a really kind of wonderful historical amnesia that happens with Dr. King that I think is really, really, really important to remember. One, and probably firstly, is that Dr. King comes from a Southern tradition. He comes from a Black Southern tradition of both liberation, but also support and, some of the bad parts of hierarchy that are attached to it. But he comes from a liberation tradition that is rooted in an area where freedom is never considered, especially by Northern liberals. Like, we always consider the South, or the popular way we think of the South, is this backwards place that's slightly threatening. And it certainly was threatening. Black folks put their lives on the line over and over again, but made actual change happen from a place where it's not supposed to happen. So we see, especially coming from largely coming from Northern press and from liberal press, this idea of the militancy of King against militarism. I know that's an awkward turn of phrase, but his aggressive position against militarism and seeing militarism as a root evil, but not seeing it as in a vacuum, right? He never said, like, we should be a demilitarized nation, but let's maintain capitalism and perfectly intact. He recognized that poverty was as violent as a bomb and was as violent as a bullet. And that was terrifying, I think, to Northern liberals who were comfortable and thought that social change you can have radical social change without a radical rethinking of your economy, either your political economy or your pocketbook economy. That you need to look at both. His biggest challenge, I think, he offered to kind of political establishment folks was that he declared that a budget was a moral document, and that a war budget is an immoral thing, and that nobody likes to be called out. And he was calling people out, and he paid a price for that.
Right.
And we see that over and over again. Like, you remember with the amnesia that happens with Dr. King is this we forget that there was polling available, and he was heavily polled by news media, by political organizations, and white folks, by and large, in the North, more than 60% considered him too radical, too forward, too aggressive, thought he had to tone down his position, that his economic stance was too far in almost every regard. You can watch it on the interviews he gave where you'd see white interviewers look at him and say, don't you think you've pushed people too far? And, I think to myself, and I hear these same comments made to our brave, brave brothers and sisters and family who have been going out into roads to call attention to our struggle as a people and calling for our liberation as a people. It's literally the same voices that we're hearing. It's the same yell. And this amnesia that somehow the liberals always knew that he was a good guy, and that he was like the greatest leader we'd ever seen, was always a little bit of wishful thinking. And it definitely betrays a history that had a huge amount of disdain for the doctor when he was alive. And now we're seeing that with our movement leaders today. There were, of course, Dr. King recognized that rebellion is a moral obligation in the face of injustice. And that means rebellion is not polite. And he was not polite about it. He was fearless. And I think people forget the fearless Dr. King.
Who is coming together for this celebration under the auspices of Jobs with Justice, correct?
Yeah, so we have it's a pretty amazing coalition. And the genesis of the coalition is pretty remarkable as well. We have several different community and labor groups who are involved, from Teamsters Local IBT 251 to the Professors Union, AAUP, here in Rhode Island. We have AARI, who's been providing some support for this, as well as individual community members, like some real heroes who've been showing up and doing some really incredible, diligent work on it. We have support from the AFL on this. It's going to be great. And it's pretty inspiring when you see, like, there's a hunger for people to kind of like say, yeah, we need that voice again. And so that's the group that's kind of come together. So we've had fairly well attended meetings, definitely very productive and pretty wonderful. So the what is actually a couple of whats. Is on the actual day, in commemoration of the day of the assassination of Dr. King, April 4th, is we are planning on having a youth art show focusing on our civil rights leader, but civil rights broadly as well. That we're asking for youth of all ages, from our littlest to our grown or nearly grown men and women and family, to produce a picture, a piece of 2D art that will be shown at a couple of different locations in Rhode Island. I can't remember specifically which one off the top of my head right now, on the day, and then possibly turn that into a moving art show that we can take around the state. We're getting submissions. We're hoping for submissions to this art show to happen before the end of February, so we can make one of the beautiful pictures we get a poster, which we're going to use for the second one, which is a large rally and speeches and performances on Saturday, April 7th, I believe starting at 12 or 1 p.m. at lot 35, downtown Providence, Rhode Island. This will be an all-day event. We have incredible speakers that are lined up that we're hoping to get, and more that we're hoping to get all the time. From local speakers like Pastor Balark of Ebenezer Baptist Church to Cleola Brown from the A. Philip Randolph Institute, to D. Miles from CPUSA, to Cornell West. We have a really ambitious lineup, and we're looking for a full day of us coming together as a community and really kind of building a future that says economic justice and racial justice are hand in hand, and that our growth as a community and our liberation is dependent on our ability to organize and build together.
So are there any points you wanted to bring up in conclusion?
Yeah, sure. Is, whether or not you can make it, obviously we would love for you to be able to come to Providence on that day. We hope as many people can come to downtown Providence as they can. But probably most importantly is that anyone that kind of hears this or reads this kind of really looks at, to borrow Cornel West's phrase, or and a religious phrase, the kind of prophetic message of Dr. King, who explored socialism from a deeply human, moral, and ethical place, to a point where it's like, in your heart it's the right thing to do, but also looked at aspects, kind of the mundane aspects of life, like how automation we have a choice. And right now we're facing a second industrial revolution that's displacing workers. And he had a clear moral position on that either we can choose to use that to liberate ourselves or to enslave us. And we're at that point. So we need to kind of reclaim that radical vision and bring it back. So hopefully you can all come. If you have any questions, you can email Rhode Island Jobs with Justice at rijobswithjustice@gmail.com, or follow us on Facebook, and you'll see the event. Hope to see you there.
Next up, we're going to go into two interviews that I think provide a very interesting conversation for activism going forward, particularly as we continue to see things evolving in the landscape, such as the Women's March or that aforementioned Martin Luther King Jr. Memorial Rally that's going to be happening in Providence. And that's the question of spontaneity. What role does spontaneity as opposed to preparation play within the context of activism and praxis in the Trump era? Over the past several years, we've seen a rebirth of left-wing politics, going back to really the World Trade Organization Battle of Seattle events in 1999. We have seen anarchism and its emphasis on spontaneous working class uprisings taking center stage, while older models of thinking and praxis, such as Leninism of any variety and flavor, has really been consigned to a archival status and is in fact poo-pooed in many anarchist circles over notions of vanguardism and tendencies towards authoritarianism. So with that in mind, first up, we're going to hear from Vijay Prashad, the great political scientist and writer who spoke with me several years ago in regards to a matter about spontaneity and how it impacts activism such as Black Lives Matter or Occupy Wall Street. Then we're going to hear from Noel Ignatiev. This is a syndication of a speech he did at Red Emma's bookstore in the DC metro area several years ago in promotion of his book A New Notion, which anthologized two writings by C.L.R. James, who, as the Caribbean Marxist thinker par excellence, perhaps should be pointed out, was one of the major contributors to notions about spontaneity as opposed to preparation and vanguardism, and the ideas that we see come into conflict that Vijay mentions, I think Ignatiev gives further emphasis to. So listen through to this, and hopefully this will generate some interesting discussions in your social activism circles. As a note to listeners, I would point out that Vijay and I originally began our conversation about a volume he had just published in the summertime of 2016 with his publishing house Left Word Books, titled Communist Histories Volume 1, and it was an anthology collecting essays about the history of the communist movement in India and the wider global south as a response to historical trends narrating the developments of the Indian independence movement that seemed to remove the Reds and, in a word, whitewash the entire history. So, I hope you will enjoy our conversation. Vijay, you have written this new volume of histories of communism in India. Can you describe the genesis and the intention going forward with this project?
Well, the book project started about 3 or 4 years ago when we had a panel, of basically communist historians at the Historical Materialism Conference in Delhi. This must have been in 2013. And our panel was very well received because most of the panelists, Elizabeth Armstrong, Suchetna Chattopadhyay, and Archana Prashad, had done original empirical work on the history of Indian communism. And it was quite a powerful panel. Now, what was interesting about that panel and the discussion that this group of us had, we sat out on the lawn at Jawaharlal Nehru University after the panel saying, we've got to do something about this. And what we discussed was two particular problems. The first was a problem of how, just in India itself, the communist movement was being written out of the narrative of Indian history. In other words, people were in good faith, perhaps, writing history books about the Indian working class, Indian peasantry, etc. And at no point did communists make an entry, not even to be criticized. They were essentially being whitewashed from history. And we thought that was irresponsible. We wanted to, as it were, bring them back into the story. So the first motive was principally historiographical. It was honesty. Let's bring them back into the story. The second issue was, I think, in a sense, more fundamental. And this is the issue about politics. Because over the last 2 or so decades, there's been an increase in thinking among the left, liberals, intellectuals, in the direction of so-called spontaneity. In other words, that uprisings happen spontaneously. People are frustrated, angry, and then they spontaneously rise up. And what they don't require is preparation, or what we used to call leadership. Leadership is another word for preparation. In other words, in times when the tempo for struggle is not very high, you prepare populations by conducting acts of courage building, confidence building, respect for each other. That's what the preparation is about, and it requires leadership. So this aspect of political struggle or leadership or preparation has been largely denigrated. I consider this a kind of neoliberalism of the left, this rise of the promotion of spontaneity above preparation. And of course, I understand politically that uprisings take place as a combination of spontaneity and preparation. Not that preparation is more important than spontaneity. But in this period of the neoliberalism of the left, spontaneity has, in a sense, overshadowed preparation. So if you don't consider preparation to be important, or why should you put it into the historical record? So, in other words, there are several studies done of peasant uprisings where the first chapter might be conditions in that area, and so the conditions are bad, and then the second chapter is the kind of conjunctural event, somebody's shot, and then there's an uprising, but there's no consideration, no chapter on preparation. And interestingly, if you write preparation out of history, leadership and preparation, the patient building of confidence among people who are exploited, if you write that out of history, you've actually methodologically written out the communists. Because when an uprising takes place, you don't necessarily see red flags everywhere. You see all kinds of anarchic forms of rebellion. But the moment of preparation is when the communists and other kind of political forces play a role. So this denigration of preparation actually opens the door, closes the door on writing the history of communism. And so when we want to bring this history back, we're also contesting this political method which suggests that there's no room for preparation. You simply or merely wait for people to rise up. If you take the Arab Spring, for instance, the way that history is written, you'll have the conditions are bad in the region, there's a youth bulge, and then one particular person, Mohammed Bouazizi, burns himself, immolates himself in Tunisia, and that is the spark that uprisings. What again disappears is the patient work conducted, for instance, in Egypt by the Textile Workers Union in Mahalla, which played a crucial role, or the very patient confidence-building work among youth done by the pro-Palestinian groups inside Egypt. They played a very significant role in creating the uprising in Egypt. But if you denigrate the process of preparation, then you lose the history of all these people. And that's what we want to really recover.
So one thing that strikes me about this project is it has a ripple effect that could impact American activism and particularly the Black Lives Matter movement, because I can't tell you how many times over the last several years I've read editorials in mainstream newspapers constantly browbeating about Martin Luther King and this angelic vision of his praxis that is really rooted in what we could call the Richard Attenborough vision of Indian history, because there's this idea that his praxis came directly from this idealized vision of Gandhi. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's a very, there are two things that you said which are very important. One is, let's take the King story first. Part of this lionization of the great man, King, Gandhi, even Malcolm X, the lionization of the great man minimizes the work that it takes to produce a movement. Lionization assumes that you're going to have a great leader appear, and by dint of rhetoric or their oratory, people will rise up and follow them. I recommend strongly a very interesting rebuttal of this approach. But again, she wrote this book around an individual to make the rebuttal. And that's Barbara Ransby's very, very good, strong biography of Ella Baker. Because Ella Baker was an organizer. And that book by Barbara Ramsey is an organizer's biography. How those who were knee deep in building popular confidence, what was their participation in a movement like? They are often the people who are written out of history, the Ella Bakers of history. These are exactly the people we are trying to recover. Who are these people? This lionization of the king figure, I mean, king deserves all the accolades he gets, but the lionization of the king, or the making king the spark, the beginning and end of the movement, the alpha and the omega of the movement, buries people like Ella Baker and the role they played in actually building popular confidence in localities. So when somebody like King would come and visit a city, there were local organizers who gave people confidence to fill the room. It wasn't by celebrity that people came to fill the room. It was dangerous to come and hear King. So you needed these, the kind of infrastructure of local confidence. And that's the organizers. So I think it's a very important point. This is also writing against lionization. You mentioned Black Lives Matter. Now, again, whether it's Black Lives Matter or Occupy, in the American political discussion, there's a tendency to assume that people sort of arrive politically. There are these gatherings, and there's no agenda, there's no leadership. This is always an assumption in the media, and then they browbeat saying, where are the leaders? Why don't they have an agenda? Well, actually, underneath each of these, let's say Occupy or Black Lives Matter, there are networks. There is this infrastructure of confidence building. There are organizers who are involved. Many of them have been organizers for decades and have great experience in knowing how to build a movement. And so there is, again, in the media, a writing out of this very crucial work that gets done to produce a movement. If you look at the leadership of Black Lives Matter, they didn't come from nowhere. They came from queer movements, they came from feminist movements, they came from socialist traditions. They come from a wide variety of confidence building dynamics. And so I think that this argument we are making, admittedly, initially it was merely about Indian historiography, I think is a bigger critique of the kind of neoliberalism of the left.
Right. So with those things in mind, tell me about being Naren, I apologize, I get this wrong, Naren Bhattacharya?
Yeah, so the first essay is by Suchetna Chattopadhyay, who's a historian at Jadavpur University in Calcutta. And Suchetna wrote a book earlier about one of the founders of the Indian Communist movement. His name is Muzaffar Ahmad. And it's a terrific book because it's not really just about Muzaffar Ahmad, who was a writer, an activist, very brilliant, very brave and brilliant man. But it was a story about the city of Calcutta. It was a story about how communists out of strangeness emerge. And what I mean is that to be a communist or to be somebody who believes in the future is a curious thing. So you have to live with people around you. You have to be with the people. At the same time, you believe things that are askance of reality. You have different ideas of gender relations. You have different ideas about social freedoms. And I think she captures that contradiction quite brilliantly. And I think all people of the left experience this. We go among the people, we live among the people, and yet we are slightly alienated from the people because we believe in certain things that are not commonplace. There was an American poet, Muriel Rukeyser, who had a beautiful line. She said, "We are, exiles from the future." We have come from the future, essentially, because we have all these ideas about gender equality, sexual freedom, and these are not shared by the working class, the peasantry among whom we work. So I think she captured that beautifully. Well, in this essay, she took up the other important founder of Indian communism, who is M.N. Roy. And M.N. Roy is quite an interesting character because Roy, of course, ends up in Mexico eventually and becomes the founder of the Mexican Communist Party. And then Roy goes to Moscow, where he very famously debates Lenin on the question of the colonial and national standpoint in the Second Communist International meeting. But what Suchetna does is she writes about the early M.N. Roy. Before he became M.N. Roy, his birth name is Naren, and Naren's story of becoming a left-wing person is very interesting. How this essentially bourgeois nationalist radicalizes himself. And why I was interested in opening the book with her essay is I think it's important for people to see how iconic figures like M.N. Roy were not always M.N. Roy. I mean, people who become important activists, or they also struggle with the process of discovery. Years ago, I wrote about Martin Luther King's discovery when he was a college student and went and worked to pick tobacco in the outskirts of Hartford, Connecticut. And he writes these letters to his mother, struggling with what he should do with his life. I think for young people to read these stories of how people struggle to become, organizers, political people, is, I think, quite inspiring. And I think that first essay is very brilliant in that.
So let's talk about the Colonial Conference and the dilemma of the Comintern's colonial work in 1928-29.
So Frederick Peterson has got to be one of the most promising young historians of the Communist International. This is a person who has, I think, control over about 15 languages, 10 languages, really quite brilliant, has understood the Communist International papers, which, are a treasure trove of material to build a story of how to understand early communism. And what Friedrich writes about in this essay is a conference that the Comintern was enthusiastic to hold, which is, you see, in the early years, they understood very well that the possibility of a breakthrough revolution in Western Europe was diminishing after the defeat of the uprising in Germany, after the defeat of uprisings in other countries, and one of them, of course, being Hungary, where there was a successful Red Republic for a short period of time. And as they came to the understanding that the breakthrough in Europe was not going to happen, there was, I think, quite a considerable amount of discussion about the so-called weakest link of them all, which were the colonies. And Lenin had written about this earlier, etc. So the Communist International was interested in getting more robust work done in the colonies. Unfortunately, the only way to do that was through the colonial countries. In other words, to get to India, they had to go through the British Communist Party because their access to India was very weak. The Indian Communist Party had been founded in 1920 in Tashkent, outside India. And the reason is they had a hard time, because of strong repression by the British government, hard time building a movement inside India. So this essay is about the attempt inside the Communist International of creating a colonial conference among mainly Western European countries, the great colonizing countries, among their left parties, to gather together and strategize how best to push for some kind of political work in the colonies. And sadly, as Friedrich shows, that conference never took place. And the reasons for that are quite interesting. A lot of it has to do with just the internal politics in the Comintern. Why I like this essay is for anybody who believes that the world of ideas dominates in history. You see that often it's not ideas, it's inertia, it's bureaucratism, it's all the other things that sometimes come in the way of a good idea.
So let's talk now about Cuba in the Red International in 1934.
Yes, so Margaret Stevens is a very, very good historian, teaches in New Jersey. I don't know if you recall, but she was one of the founders of the Iraq Veterans Against the War. And Margaret has written a dissertation, and this chapter comes out of the dissertation, which is essentially bringing to life the role of the left between the Americas, across the Americas, whether in the Caribbean or the United States, the linkage between the North and the South. And what she shows in this chapter in particular is the way in which, remember, I said that the Communist International often, to get to the colonies, had to go through the colonial powers left party. So in this case, the Communist International was in touch with the CPUSA, the Communist Party of the United States, to engage in Cuba. And the chapter is about an uprising in Cuba, the creation of a commune, Commune 18, inside Cuba, which was inspired and led by Cuban communists, and the conflict between the kind of red international in North America, the Cubans, and Moscow. And she, I think, really very nicely brings alive that world of the uprising, the leadership, the kind of struggles between them, and in a sense, how faulty leadership played a role in not being able to push the movement, and at the same time, the exaggerated sense of the power of the people at the time, was also at fault, meaning that sometimes people might rise up, but they might rise up too early. The island wasn't prepared for an uprising. But it's an interesting essay because it shows you that there are prehistories of the Cuban Revolution of 1959, which are rooted in the communist movement. One of the ways in which we understand Cuba is that there's a kind of nationalist revolt in 1959. Castro comes to America, the Americans snub him, and then he turns to the Soviet Union. But what this essay shows you is that there are, essentially older histories of communist rebellion inside Cuba that perhaps contributed in a great way to the revolution.
Right. So let's talk now about the Indian peasant woman's activism in a hot Cold War.
So now this is one of the essays that was presented at the Historical Materialism Conference in Delhi in 2013. And this is another interesting essay. So Elizabeth Armstrong had written a book about the All India Democratic Women's Association, AIDWA, which is, one of the largest women's groups in the world. There are 13 million members, and it's a communist women's group in India today. And it was an interesting book about the kind of organizational theory of AIDWA. Because the idea was that how is it that in the time of neoliberalism, when all around the world movements are suffering, this group has essentially doubled its membership. So she has been interested in the question of organization and the organizational space between theory and practice. So this is a step backwards, looking at the prehistory of AIDWA. And here she does a couple of things. One is she looks at the creation of pan-Indian political women's organizations like the All India Women's Congress, which was a nationalist women's organization, and alongside that, the emergence of communist women's groups, first within the All India Women's Congress and then outside it. And what is interesting is, see, India is largely, even today, about 70% of India lives in rural areas. But then it was overwhelmingly a rural country, which meant that no mass organization could essentially bypass the question of the peasantry. And interestingly, what the bourgeois women's groups in India wanted to do in the nationalist period is to have the peasant women essentially follow them. They would be the leaders and the peasant women would be the masses. But what the communists had to engage with is they wanted to organize the peasant women and make them essentially, have power over the movements, to create democratic movements. And so this is the history of that struggle between the bourgeois women's movements and the communist women's movements. And what essentially is the fulcrum of the essay is in 1943, there was a famine in which about perhaps as many as 3 million Indians died in order to feed British troops, essentially. And the Indian women communists became some of the leaders in organizing relief against the famine. And it's in the experience of working in the famine that they developed the skills to create the Indian Women's Communist Front, which continues to play an important role and essentially then is the precursor to the All India Women's Democratic Association. So that's that chapter. But one of the interesting theoretical things that comes out of the chapter is how this experience of building confidence among the masses transformed the very understanding that these communist women had of politics. That they didn't come there with a pre-written script. It was the experiences that produced an understanding of how to organize. In other words, organizing is always a relationship between the person who arrives and says, let's meet together, and the person who comes to the meeting. There is no passiveness if it's genuinely done. And I think this essay shows very well how there was an active engagement between the organizers and those who themselves became organizers in the process.
So, from there, let's talk about the Lost International and the transformation of Chinese socialism.
Yeah, so this is one of the underlying themes of this first volume, because hopefully we'll have more volumes, is internationalism and the role of internationalism in the left movement. Even in small localities, even if you're in the middle of a peasant struggle, what differentiates a communist organizer from others is that they have an internationalist perspective. So Lin Chan, who's a highly regarded scholar of China, writes about global capitalism, has written very, very good books on Chinese politics and labor, tackles a sensitive question, which is the question of what happens to Chinese socialism, or rather its internationalism, when its understanding of socialism begins to alter. So what she argues is that from the 1930s, but of course especially from 1949 till the 1990s, Chinese socialism was had a deeply internationalist agenda. And that internationalist agenda, of course, can be not always, it doesn't always work in a way that one might like, but it was nonetheless internationalist. And by which I mean, the Chinese, after all, did decide that the Soviet Union was a greater threat than the United States, and decided to, come to terms with the United States when Nixon visits China. I mean, that could be, it should be, I think, understood as a problematic direction that its internationalism went in, but nonetheless, it was internationalist. And then she suggests that with the change of economic policy, the political internationalism of China begins to shift. And it has a different understanding of its international role. So it's an interesting chapter. It's a suggestive chapter. It's suggestive because it suggests that after the kind of slow decline of American unipolarity, as China begins to enter the world stage, what is its international consciousness? And she suggests that its international consciousness is almost entirely removed from that of the high point of Chinese communism. And I found that a very interesting kind of argument. So even though it's not as locally grounded, granular as some of the other chapters in the volume, it's very thoughtful, and I wanted to have something anyway from China.
So, from here, let's talk about the Warli movement and its living histories.
The Warli movement, when we released the book in Mumbai, in Bombay, just a few weeks ago, one of the people who came to speak on the book was Comrade L.P. Dhanger, who was 88 years old. And he spoke eloquently about the history of the Warli uprising and then his role in the Warli uprising. The Warli uprising was a major Adivasi or indigenous uprising in Western India against the new Indian government, against the kind of land and forest policy of the new Indian government. And it was seeded and led by important communist leaders, including Godavari Parulekar. And what the historian Archana Prashad has done is Archana went and interviewed people like Comrade Dhanger and others who lived at as children at that time, but then also struggled right through the century with the commitments of the Warli uprising. And what she found, she first gives a very good, assessment of the Warli uprising. But what she found was that, the initial people like Godavari Parulekar, when they came in to prepare for an uprising, they also produced a new generation of leaders among the Warlis themselves. And it's this generation that takes up the cudgel for the next couple of decades, So it's an important story because, you see, it writes against the assumption that outsiders come in, outsiders, let's say communists come in, they seed something, and then they continue to lead it. What she shows is that it's not like there are communists and then Warlis, because within a few years, the Warlis become communists, and they become leaders in their region. And that has decades-long effect through families, through communities. The other thing she finds is because the Warli region has a living history of struggle against the Indian government's land and forest policy, they have a living memory of the uprising. In other places that she looks at, where there is no history of struggle after an uprising, the living memory dies. I thought this was a very interesting point. In other words, let's assume that there are two places in a country. Place one and place two both have major rebellions in the 1930s. Place one has not only the rebellion in the 30s, but it continues to have a history of struggle. Place two does not have a history of struggle after the rebellion. So what Archana would suggest, what she's found is, where there is a living memory of struggle, they have a living memory of the rebellion. Where there's no struggle afterwards, the rebellion is forgotten. I thought this should be useful for historians, where we assume, for instance, that there are places where there was no struggle. Let's take American history. You go up to the states in the up in the places like Nebraska or Wyoming, and you assume that Wyoming has always been Dick Cheney country. But in fact, merely because in the last several decades there's been no populist or left uprisings there, doesn't mean that there's no great history of populist, people's uprisings in places like Wyoming. Because if you go back and look at it, some of those states had very great farmers' movements, cattlemen's movements that, some of them, of course, are drenched with the history of massacring Native Americans, but some of them also have linkages to the international workers of the world. which had roots in some of those states. So that lack of a living history, Archana suggests, means that you forget these pasts. And the reason you forget these pasts is that neither state historiography nor professional bourgeois historiography is going to keep alive that memory.
Right. So, in closing, I just wanted to talk briefly about what you've described as this neoliberalism of the left and emphasis on spontaneity. CLR James moved towards a position that emphasized spontaneous action in some regards. Is that correct? At the end of his life?
I'm not that sure. I mean, I've read a number of James, but I've read mainly, Andrew, honestly, I've read mainly the early James.
Okay.
I know his Black Jacobins very well, and of course, Beyond the Boundaries, one of my favorite books on cricket. Mm-hmm. But I don't really know the later James.
Okay. Because you just mentioned the IWW, the Wobblies, and one of the things that I've found by looking at the book Towards a Soviet America by William Z. Foster is he was originally a member of the IWW during its heyday, and he brought to that book and to his vision of communism taking root in America of sort of dual power vision that came from the IWW. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that sort of logic.
You see, this is important, and I think we should at some point have a long discussion or some kind of discussion about this. In the early period of left struggles in the late 19th and early 20th century, there were many different trajectories for the struggle, whether you call it, syndicalism or anarchism or at the time social democracy, eventually communism. These were different theories of struggle, but all of them shared a basic understanding that the people have, they experience exploitation, they experience oppression, but they are not prepared to rise up. And the reason they are not prepared to rise up are twofold. One is they may not have the confidence to rise up. In other words, that there are cultures that that produce different kinds of attitudes, whether it's through religion, fatalism, sense of fear, repression. The culture of God and the police, minimize confidence in people. So one is the role, whether you were an anarchist at the time or you were a communist, you believed that you must go amongst the people and raise up their confidence. The other one, where there was a disagreement in some sections, was over the use of violence. You see, one strand, which was one strand of anarchism, believed that you needed to use essentially homeopathic doses of terror by assassinating people, etc., the so-called propaganda of the deed, and that this propaganda of the deed would rouse people up, give them confidence to rise up. Another section believed no, it was not by seeing something happen that people get confidence, but it's by acting. In other words, the movements must go among the people and produce small struggles, bigger struggles, to give people greater and greater confidence. This was a real political debate in the early part of the 20th century. And in India, for instance, one of the great iconic figures of our movement is Bhagat Singh, who believed in the propaganda of the deed. When he went to prison, Bhagat Singh wrote a pamphlet called Why I Am an Atheist. And in this pamphlet, he had a very interesting synthesis of the two approaches. He said in that, for mass struggles, non-violence is essential. In times of great necessity, violence is indispensable. In other words, when you are threatened, when your life is threatened, you have to fight back. But to build a mass movement, non-violence is indispensable. That was Bhagat Singh's synthesis of the two. He didn't say one is better. He said there's a different use for different strategies. And why I'm saying all this is that this debate at the time was a rich debate because what everybody shared was the idea that you cannot have politics without building mass movements. Now, today, why I say neoliberalism of the left is that the idea of building mass movements, and with the emphasis on the word building, the idea of building, preparing mass movements is not very much there. We would like to participate in manifestations, in occupies and things like that. We would like to be involved in a march. But we don't actually see the very hard work that it goes to build confidence towards those events. And we don't have a shared discussion. So when say anarchists and others are having a debate, they have a debate about tactics. Should you do this? Should you do that? The question isn't should you do this, should you do that? The primary question is how do you build confidence among the masses of people who experience hierarchies, who experience exploitation, who experience oppression? The principal question shouldn't be a narcissism of tactics. What's the correct tactic? The principal question should be how do you build popular confidence? And in the previous generations, that was a shared understanding. Today, that is not a shared understanding.
Gotcha. Are there any other points you'd like to bring up in closing about this volume?
Well, the one thing I would like to say, Andrew, is that the book is published by Leftward Books. We are a small Marxist publishing house in Delhi. And, our goal essentially is to become a very good, important publishing house in the English language and also in Indian languages. That's our goal. And, our books are available through ebooks. So we very much recommend that people go to the website leftward.com, have a look, read our books, review our books, fight with us. The last thing a Marxist publisher would like to experience is being ignored. So we want people to take us seriously. We don't necessarily want anybody to agree with us, but please don't ignore us.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for your time today, Vijay.
Thanks a lot, Andrew.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Happy to introduce Noel Ignatiev, who wanted me to let you know that in 1989, 1990, he was named by Rolling Stone as one of the most dangerous minds in America, which is pretty awesome. We've known Noel's work for a long time. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this book, which has just been reprinted, How the Irish Became White, right? Which for a lot of people thinking about race and the way race works, the way race is tied to all sorts of other mechanisms and social control, social exploitation. This book has, been really a major touchstone, and even the title sounds to me like almost like a truism these days. But it's actually a really amazing piece of radical history and radical scholarship and radical theory. So I was really excited when we heard that PM Press was putting out a new edition of another one of our favorite authors, C.L.R. James, who you're going to hear a lot about tonight, so I won't go into it. But this is a collection of two very important pamphlet essays that C.L.R. James was involved in writing in the mid 20th century, and it's got a new and substantial introduction by Noel Ignatiev. And Noel was gracious enough to come here tonight and introduce his take on the work of C.L.R. James. And please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you, and thank you also to the people who maintain this wonderful space and this venue for people to come and talk and pursue ideas in a non-academic but serious setting. I intend to talk about an hour or a little less and then leave time for questions and discussion. You know what? If somebody would let me have a watch that I could put here, that I could watch it to keep track. Is there anyone? Okay. That means you at least have to stay till I'm done. Okay. This is one of these watches that has numbers on it instead of that. Well, all right. Cyril Lionel Robert James was born in Trinidad in 1901 to a middle-class black family. He grew up with two passions, literature and cricket. As a young man, he wrote a novel and several short stories about the people of the island he had met on the cricket playing fields. In 1932, he moved to England, where he covered cricket for the Manchester Guardian and became heavily involved in radical politics. He wrote a play in which he and Paul Robeson appeared on the London stage, and histories of the San Domingo Revolution and the Communist International, and a survey of African revolts. Together with his childhood friend George Padmore, James founded the International African Service Bureau, which became a center for the struggle for the independence of Africa, helping to cultivate Jomo Kenyatta, Kwame Nkrumah, and others who would later play important roles on the world stage. In 1938, James came to the United States on a speaking tour. He ended up staying for 15 years. While in the U.S., he wrote studies of Hegel and Herman Melville, a 300-page outline study of American civilization, and a number of shorter works. During World War II, he lived among and organized sharecroppers in southeastern Missouri. In 1952, James was arrested and interned on Ellis Island. The following year, he was deported from the United States. In 1968, taking advantage of the rising mood of revolution on the campuses, a group of black American students in Chicago brought James to the U.S., where he held university teaching posts and lectured widely until 1980. For the last years of his life, he lived in South London and lectured on politics, Shakespeare, and other topics. He died there in 1989 and was buried in Trinidad at a ceremony presided over by the Oil Workers Union. In the West Indies, James is honored as one of the fathers of independence, and in Britain as a historic pioneer of the black movement. He is regarded generally as one of the major figures in Pan-Africanism, and he led in developing a current within Marxism that was democratic, revolutionary, and internationalist. Obviously, this is a remarkable legacy, and if the word genius has any meaning, then it must be applied to C.L.R. James. Most important, however, is not his individual qualities, but the notion that enabled him to bring light to so many different spheres of activity. What was James's notion, and how did it enable him to make unique contributions in so many areas? Before I go any further, am I speaking loudly enough for the people in the back row to hear me? Okay. For James, the starting point was that the working class is revolutionary. He did not mean that it is potentially revolutionary, or that it is revolutionary when imbued with correct ideas or when led by the proper political organization. He said the working class is revolutionary and that its daily activities constitute the revolutionary process in modern society. James's project was to discover, document, and elaborate the aspects of working class activity that constitute the revolution in today's world. This project enabled him and his co-thinkers to produce a body of literature far ahead of its time, works that still constitute indispensable guides for those fighting for a new world. James focused his attention on the point of production, documenting the emergence on the workplace floor of social relations counter to those imposed by management and the official structures of the union. Not every example that he cited was from production. In 1955, commenting on the events in Montgomery on the bus boycott, James wrote, quote, "The defense of their full citizenship rights by Negroes is creating a new concept of citizenship and community. When for months 50,000 Negroes in Montgomery, Alabama, do not ride buses and organize overnight their own system of transportation, welfare, and political discussion and decision. That is the beginning of the new society. The community as the center of full and free association and as the bulwark of the people against the bureaucratic state. The right of women to choose their associates as freely as men. The ability of any man to do any job if given the opportunity. Freedom of movement and of association as the expansion rather than the limitation of human personality. The American as a citizen not just of one country but of the world. All this is the new world into which the Negro struggle is giving everybody a glimpse." Unquote. That is the new society, and there is no other. Ordinary people, organized around work and activities related to it, taking steps in opposition to capital to expand their freedom and their capacities as fully developed individuals. It is a leap of imagination, but it is the key to his method. Of course, the new society does not triumph without an uprising, but it exists. It may be stifled temporarily. Capital, after all, can shut down the plant or even a whole industry and can starve out an entire community. But the new society springs up elsewhere. If you want to know what the new society looks like, said James, study closely the daily activities of the working class. I want to draw upon my own experience of over 20 years working in steel mills, farm equipment factories, machine tool plants to illustrate some of the points that James was making. And I should say, by the way, when I met James a couple of times, and once he asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him I was a factory worker, he said to me that I always regretted that I never had the opportunity to do that. And I said to him, well, but you know, your writings have helped me make a great deal of sense of my own experience. And he said, yes, people have told me that, but I still wish I had had the opportunity. So I want to, with that preface, I want to tell you a couple of stories from my own factory days that I think will illustrate kind of some of the points that James was getting at. I once had a job operating a horizontal boring mill in a plant that manufactured punch presses, machine tools, and die sets. My job was to bore holes and mill contours on the large die sets that were individually made to the customer's specifications. The boring mill was an old-fashioned, manually controlled machine, well built and originally quite expensive, capable of turning out high-quality work. The plant operated on an incentive pay system. Each job was time-rated for the machine on which it was to be performed, and the operator received a bonus for all he managed to produce above the nominal 8-hour standard. Jobs varied, but the bonus could amount to as much as half a worker's total wage. In order to be fair to the employees on the bonus system, it was necessary to make allowance for circumstances outside of direct production, such as time spent sharpening tools, loading parts on a machine, waiting for the crane when it was occupied elsewhere, filling the coolant tanks, and so forth. This was done through a system of red-colored cards, each one computer-coded for a special account, which were punched into the time clock when it was necessary to take an allowance. When I first started on the job, one of the veteran operators called me over and explained the system to me. He says, "You see those red cards?" He says, "If the company won't give you a raise, you take those red cards and give yourself a raise. That's what they're for." Well, I took his advice and studied hard and soon became sufficiently creative in using the red cards to assure myself several hours bonus per day. Across the aisle in the same department, the company installed a new tape-controlled milling machine, able to do more or less the same work as the horizontal machine that I was working on in about half the time. As soon as it was set up, the management began routing the jobs to the new machine and assigning to us only the overflow and the special large jobs that wouldn't fit on the workbed of the new one. They also retimed the jobs to fit the performance rating of the new machine, thus making it impossible for us to make any bonus. There were 3 of us on the horizontal mill, 1 on each shift. When we saw what was going on, we petitioned for a return to the old rates on jobs that were sent to our machine. When our petition was denied, we slowed down. Since the most we could hope to turn out, even with intense effort, was about 6 hours, not enough to make bonus, we opted for a collapse and began turning in a whole lot less, as we saw there was no point in straining ourselves to make the same hourly rate we could make by coasting. The most amazing part of the whole business, to the best of my recollection, this little strike on the job was set in motion without a single meeting among the 3 of us. Because of our different shifts, we were never all together, though each of us saw the other 2 on a daily basis. Much less, of course, the intervention of any officials from the union. One of the 3 of us, I no longer remember which one, simply announced one day to the operator coming onto the shift after him, he says, "I'm fed up with this. I gave them an hour and a half tonight, and that's all I'm doing from now on." The next man followed suit, and after a few weeks we had established our own production norm, somewhere around 3/4 of an hour each shift. It became standard practice on reporting for work to inquire of the departing operator how much he had turned out on his shift, and then do the same or less, if possible. Of course, the company did not like what was going on, but short of assigning a foreman full-time to observe each of us, how could they know when a tool burned up and needed replacing, or when the tool crib was out of the required item and it was necessary to wait while one was ground, and how long the operator had to wait, or when the coolant in the machine needed replenishing, or any of the other mysteries of a machine operator's life, each one faithfully recorded on a red card punched through the computer that never lies. Things went on in this fashion for a while, with us pretending to work and the company pretending to pay us, until one day the foreman came to me and announced that since efficiency on the horizontal mill was so low, they had decided to eliminate one of the 3 operators. Since I had the least seniority, it was on me the axe would fall. I had a choice. I could take a layoff, or I could retrain on the tape-controlled machine, which at the time was idle on 1 shift. I chose the latter course and was soon installed as the 3rd shift operator on the tape-controlled milling machine. Shortly afterwards, the other 2 horizontal mill operators, who had continued their slowdown without me, were transferred to another department, and the machine was sold off for a fraction of its cost to a merchant who dealt in used machine tools. The 3 of us destroyed that horizontal boring mill, which originally sold for somewhere around $100,000, just as effectively as if we had taken a torch and sledgehammer to it. Although it remained intact and capable of performing the task for which it was designed, it had ceased to exist as capital, the only form of value in contemporary society. When I first went to work in the steel mills, after a decade of work in other industries, I was astonished at the degree to which the workers had managed to establish their own control over the pace of work. In part, it had to do with the nature of steel production. Once the raw materials are in the furnace, they can't be counted or drilled or assembled or stacked up or stamped or any of the other things done on assembly lines. But the technique was not the whole explanation, however, for the steel companies were forever trying to combine jobs and rationalize assignments to take advantage of dead time, and the workers were always resisting. I remember once, not too long after I started work in the mill, the foreman coming into one of the shanties where a bunch of us were sitting around. We were in maintenance, some snoozing, some drinking coffee, some playing cards. and asked two of the men to go out and see about a certain piece of equipment that had broken down. "Can't you see I'm busy?" came the reply of one man who was gathering the cards for the next deal. "We'll get it when the rain stops," conceded his partner. The foreman left, apparently satisfied that he had got the most he could out of that particular group at that moment. After all, he had to live with those people the next day. The pace of work in an enterprise is the result of thousands, millions of such daily encounters. Where the workers are well organized, it is they who break in the new employees, initiating them in the patterns established over decades of invisible struggle. And I remember when I started in my first factory job, I was assigned to one of the older workers, and the first thing he did was teach me how to run the machine, and then the next thing he did was teach me how to break the machine so I could get a break when I needed it. And see, I think at Wisconsin Steelworks in Chicago, and one of the things that fascinated me about the steel mill, steel, is it's a continuous process, and particularly in the liquid areas where they're cooking the iron ore and the limestone and the coke. And you can't interrupt it and you can't stop it. I understand there was a steel mill someplace in Colorado in 1911 that the IWW pulled a strike at, and they shut it down, and there's still a block of iron frozen solid in that furnace. So I have heard. In any case, the way the companies did it was they maintained a continuous system of operation, and so if a person did not show up for his shift, they would ask the person on the shift before him to stay over for another 8-hour shift. Given the pace of work in the mill, that was not impossible. It's not an automobile assembly line. Perhaps some of you know Sparrows Point or even had experience working there, and you know that people were not killing themselves in the furnace areas. They were sometimes being killed by the furnaces, but they weren't being killed by the pace of work. In any case, so what people began to do was they would deliberately call off and give the person before them an extra 8 hours at overtime pay, and then they had a system of rotation worked out, so a couple weeks later it would come around to their turn and somebody would call off for them and they would get it. The result of it was every worker got a shift off every 2 weeks and got an extra 4 hours pay. And all this was done outside of the union, outside of negotiations, and it was a complicated system. You see, and when things got too bad, and the company was not like A calls off for B and B calls off for A. We were much cleverer than that. We had a whole rotation figured out.
Approximately what years are you talking about?
1970s. But I worked there from 71 to 75. I'm sure it had been going on for years before. Anyhow, that was one example, you see. I mean, there were many, many examples in the mills of things that I saw like that. At Wisconsin Steelworks in Chicago, which was a subsidiary of International Harvester, the management sought for several years to introduce time cards that would be punched at the entrance to the gate rather than to be carried to the particular mill inside the plant where people worked. And there were big strikes and resistance. People didn't want to hand in their time cards at the front gate. They wanted to hand them in at the local mill. And I see a look of puzzlement there. Why? What difference would it make to an employee where he handed in his time card? Well, that was a mystery. Nobody in Chicago could understand that except the people who worked in the mill. And if you went and talked to them, then they could explain. The issue was, if you handed in your card, and sometimes, the particular mill you worked in could be a mile or two away from the front gate. If you handed in your card at the mill that you worked in, you would give it to a foreman whom you had known, who you had all kinds of arrangements with, who would like you take the day off, for instance, or go hide someplace for 6 hours, or go sit across the street and drink beer while the shift was going on. And he would punch your card for you in return, of course, for some consideration, right? Whereas if you had to hand in your time card at the front gate, you would have to give it to a uniformed plant guard with whom you had no history, no relationship, and who would be rotated. The result of it was, here was this strike that went on inside the mill on and off for weeks. And what difference, nobody could ever understand what difference it made, except if you were familiar with the realities of life in a steel mill. You saw it made all the difference in the world, you see. And it was that kind of internecine civil war, really, that was going on throughout American industry in the years that I worked there. I worked in industry from about 1960 to 1984. That was going on throughout all those years, and which I am convinced was perhaps the most bitter and pervasive war that went on in the United States during all those years, and was virtually unrecognized and undocumented by any of the public sources. And I remember once going to when I first started in the mill, I went to one of the union big shots who was a radical, I think of the Communist Party or one of the other groups. And I asked him, what about the movement of the steelworkers? And he says, well, there is no movement of steelworkers. What are you talking about? Well, to him, movement meant the number of people who voted for his candidate in the union election, or who signed his petition, or who attended the meetings of his caucus. That was what movement meant to him. The fact that in his steel mill, thousands of workers, at least hundreds of them, had ripped off half the workday out of the control of the steel company, that was of no consequence to him. That was not a movement. That was nothing that he could recognize. I believe that Karl Marx, who wrote a whole chapter in Volume 1 of Capital on the struggle over the length of the working day, would have recognized that struggle and would have given it a political character. Now, you know, in the opening lines of the Communist Manifesto, Marx says the history of all hitherto existing societies is the history of class struggle. Of course, everybody knows that quote, and it's one of the most widely misread comments by Marx, because he does not say that the history of society is the domination of one class by another. He says it's the struggle between classes. That's what I am recounting to you. Now, he also goes on to say, in every case in the past, either this struggle resulted in the revolutionary reconstitution of the new society, or in the common ruin of the contending classes. Now that's, I submit to you, what the examples that I have told you are small, sort of microcosmic examples of that kind of a thing. Because we were not strong enough to overturn the domination of capital, thank you. On the other hand, they were not strong enough to make us work.
Put together, you deindustrialized the United States.
Precisely my point. Precisely my point. It is these. I remember after I left the mill, talking to one of the fellows back there in Gary, Indiana, and he said, you know, they can't make us old guys work. He says, but they sure are whipping the ass of the young people. But it wasn't enough, because I am absolutely convinced that the deindustrialization of the United States is in significant part due to the inability of capital to discipline the labor force in the large-scale industries. Now, I understand this is more true in some industries than others. It has partly to do with technique, has partly to do with the experience and so forth. I'm not suggesting it was that way everywhere. But in the older industries where workers had gotten to know each other, had come to trust each other and so forth, this kind of regime, so that by the 1970s, the management studies, they were talking about if they could get 5 hours work out of a laborer in an 8-hour shift, they were happy. That was above the average, you see. And absolutely, I mean, I'm quite convinced that, for instance, the shutdown of Sparrows Point and the emergence of the life depicted in that TV series, The Wire, is directly a response to the experience of the struggles of the workers at Sparrows Point and Gary Works and every place else in the United States. Now, see, James insisted that the struggles of the working class are the chief motor in transforming society. Even before it overthrows capital, the working class compels it to new stages in its development. Looking back at U.S. history, the resistance of the craftsmen compelled capital to develop methods of mass production. The workers responded to mass production by organizing the big mass production industries, unions. which was an attempt to impose their control on the rhythms of production. Capital retaliated by incorporating the union into its administrative apparatus. The workers answered with the wildcat strike and a whole set of shop floor informal relations outside of the control of the union. Capital responded to this autonomous activity by moving the industries out of the country in search of a more pliant working class and introducing computerized production to eliminate workers altogether. The working class has responded to the threat of permanent separation from the means of obtaining life with squatting, rebellion, and food riots, and so forth. This is a continuous process, and it moves the society forward. James observed the triumph of the counter-revolution in Russia, the crushing of the workers' movement in Europe by fascism, and the role of the communist parties, and he concluded that these developments indicated that capital had reached a new stage. This new stage he called state capitalism, in which the state assumes the functions of capital and the workers remain exploited proletarians. Like every development in capitalist society, it was a product of workers' activity. The labor bureaucracy, that alien force ruling over the working class, grows out of the accomplishments of the workers' movement. In a modern society like the United States, the working class struggles not against past defeats, but against past victories, against the institutions that the workers themselves have created and which have become forms of domination over them. And to this, as examples of this, I would offer you the trade unions, the political system, electoral politics, the public school system, and virtually every other reform that people have gained over the last century and a half through struggle and sacrifice has become transformed into a means of domination over them. And as to James, I remember discussing this once with him. He said to me flat out, the American workers will never get anywhere until they get rid of these unions. Well, what's to replace them? That we will get to in a moment. The social role of the labor bureaucracy is to absorb and, if necessary, repress the autonomous movement of the working class. And it scarcely matters whether it is the Communist Party in France, the Labour Party in Britain, or the trade unions and Democratic Party in the United States. That if you can imagine, he says, the rulers of Russia, he says, perform the same functions as are performed by Ford, General Motors, the coal operators, and their huge bureaucratic staffs. If you could imagine what the United States, if the trade unions ever came to power, imagine a political crisis, a deep economic crisis, in which the government was forced to draw in some of the unions into the national planning. In fact, they've done that. They did that in World War I and World War II. Was forced to nationalize some more industries and to absorb the representatives of the workers into the planning bodies, then you would have the equivalent of what took place in the Stalinist states in Russia. A state capitalist society in which people who were promoted into their positions through the struggles of the workers become transformed into rulers over the workers. Now, others before James had come to similar conclusions about Russia. But James's theory was a theory not of Russia, but of the world. It applied to Germany, England, and the United States as much as to Russia. And I would submit to you that while I would never deny that the political context and to some degree the political content of the difference between, say, Roosevelt, Hitler, and Stalin, I don't mean to say that politically they were all the same. But the fundamental direction of the economic development in all these places was essentially identical. The merger of the state and capital, the expansion of the role of the state, and the functioning of bureaucrats dominating private owners in determining the direction of the entire society. And of course the politics are different because of the different histories and the different contexts of the country, but the direction towards state capital is what James was identifying, and that's what makes his work, in part, such a work of genius, because he was not noticing specific cases, but was generalizing, which is the function of theory. This understanding, and see, his understanding of the role of the bureaucracy prepared James and his colleagues to see the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, the French General Strike of 1968, and the emergence of U.S. wildcat strikes in the 1950s and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit in 1968 as expressions of a global revolt against the domination of capital. In an industrial country, it is not the guns and tanks of the government that hold the workers down. When the working class moves, the state is powerless against it. This was true in Hungary in 1956, it was true in France in 1968, it was true in Poland in 1980, and it was true in South Africa in 1981. It is not guns and tanks, but the relations of capital within the working class that hold the workers back. According to James, the working class develops through the overcoming of internal antagonisms, not external foes. He saw a civil war within the ranks of the working class and within the mind of each individual worker. Two ways of looking at the world, although not necessarily and not usually articulated, but ways that are manifested in different sorts of behavior. Consistent with this, he saw the autonomous activities of groups within the working class as a crucial part of its self-development. See, now, one of the ways that he felt that this was being interpreted was through culture. So that, for instance, my favorite of C.L.R. James's work is Mariners, Renegades, and Castaways, his study of Moby Dick. And in that, what he does is he counterposes the authority of the captain and the officers to the authority, unformulated authority of the workers on the ship. And he shows how that battling out, and of course we all know how it turns out. Once again, they were not strong enough to overthrow Ahab. He was not strong enough to crush them, and so the ship went to the bottom. Clearly, this is an allegory for a present United States and a modern world. But it's a remarkable piece of work. It's a remarkable piece of work. James examines every aspect, and it's just a short work of American life. Anyhow, it's also, by the way, contains, in my opinion, the best description I have ever read of the process of literary creation. And for that alone, I recommend it to you. In any case, see, as a Marxist, James believed that the working class, united, disciplined, and organized by the very mechanism of capitalist production, had a special role to play in carrying the revolution through to the end. But he also believed that the struggles of other groups had their own validity, and they represented challenges to the working people as a whole to build a society free of the domination of one class over another. Long before the rise of the Black Power movement, for instance, James spoke of the need for a mass movement of black people, responsible only to black people and outside of the control of any of the radical left-wing parties. He and his colleagues adopted a similar attitude toward the struggles of women and youth. A Woman's Place, 1950, produced by members of the Tendency led by James, examined the daily life of working-class women in the home, the neighborhood, and the workplace, took an unequivocal stand on the side of women's autonomy. They brought the same insights to the struggle of youth. Here you have this revolutionary, and of course he also paid close attention to the struggles of the colonial peoples. His classic work, The Black Jacobins, which is the standard history of the uprising in San Domingo, showed the role of the uprising of the people of San Domingo and its link to the struggles of the workers in Paris. Really serves as a model, in a way, for looking at the function of the anti-colonial struggles in the world in the recent period. Here you have this revolutionary working class, said James. How am I doing on time? And at the same time, you have the domination of capital, which also expresses itself within the working class. Well, see, that's what's got to be played out. That paradox, that contradiction, that unfolding of the internal antagonism is what has to be played out. He talks about that in his book on cricket. He talks about that in various other places. By the way, you don't have to know how to play cricket to read that book. And again, I want to draw upon an experience that I had. I was working in a factory one time, and there was this woman that I worked with, a black woman, who had bid on a job as a crane operator. It represented a promotion for her. And in order for her to get the job, she had to be trained by the other crane operators. And the crane operators, white men, didn't want to train her, didn't want to open up that job to her for reasons I'm sure you can imagine. And so they sabotaged her learning efforts. They wouldn't help her make the hookups on the crane. They wouldn't do the things she needed to get the job. And every day they would stand there waiting at the time clock to see if she was coming in that day to determine if they had succeeded in running her out. And she told me the story. She says, you know, I told those people. She says, I called them aside one morning. I said, listen, you motherfuckers. I am here for exactly the same reason you are here, to pay the rent and feed my babies. He said, I am not asking for any special consideration as a woman. I am just asking to be respected as a crane operator. And you can forget about running me out of here because I will be here after you are gone. Well, their response, according to her, was very interesting. It was like they rolled over on their back like puppies to have their tummies scratched. They became entirely cooperative, helpful, and so forth. And see, I think that's, you know, and this was obviously a person of tremendous moral force. But I think that little story is an indication, because what gave her strength was the whole new society that had mobilized behind her and that gave her that moral force and compelled them to respond to it when it was asserted to them. And that, to me, was one of the most memorable examples that I have seen, and of course I've cited you others, of the struggle between the old society and the new society, and how the new society is constantly struggling to break free and to overcome the old patterns. The task of freeing that new society from what inhibits it led James to a certain concept of organization. He spent his whole life building organizations, but the function of those organizations was not to lead the working class, but to accomplish this or that specific task. He analyzed the organizational history of the workers' movement and showed that different political organizations represented certain stages in political development. In modern societies, said James, whoever leads the working class keeps it subordinated to capital. A revolutionary crisis is defined precisely by the breakdown of the traditional institutions and leadership of the working class. And James argued that it was among the sectors of society least touched by official institutions that relations characteristic of the new society would first appear. That is, among black folk, among youth, and among women. It is not the job of revolutionaries to organize the mass movements. That is the job of union functionaries and other bureaucrats. It is the job of revolutionaries to organize themselves to accomplish their tasks. Well, what were those tasks? What is the task of revolutionaries? Well, James was careful. He didn't talk much about that in his writing because he did not want to be taken for a representative of one of the old-style vanguard parties and so forth. So mainly he emphasized the task is not to lead, not to manipulate, not to try and dominate. But here and there in some of his works, he does explain what one of the tasks is. And I want to quote from another one of his works, Facing Reality. I don't know if you have that one here. Yes. In a section, James talks about what to do and how to do it. And he lays out a certain kind of popular paper that will document the new society as it emerges within the shell of the old. And he takes up, for a specific example, a struggle over in the United States, what was then, at that time, called the Negro question in the United States. And he makes two observations. One is that many white workers who are willing to work together with black folk on the job resist any kind of collaboration with them off the job and, in fact, do not wish to associate with them and do their best to keep them out of their schools and neighborhoods. The second observation he makes is that many black folk make race relations a test of all other relations. That becomes the test of who they decide who their friends and enemies are. James says, well, what's the organization to do about that? He says, well, inside a paper like that, and I'm quoting James, Negro aggressiveness takes its proper place as one of the forces helping to create the new society. If a white worker finds that articles or letters expressing Negro aggressiveness on racial questions makes the whole paper offensive to him, that means it is he. Did you have your hand up? Were you going to ask something? Okay. That means it is he who is putting his prejudices before the interests of the working class as a whole. He must be reasoned with, argued with, and if necessary, fought to a finish. Well, James says, how is he to be reasoned with, argued with, and if necessary, fought to a finish? He says, first, by making it clear that his ideas, his reasons, his fears, his prejudices also have every right in the paper. See, now, along with that, the Marxist organization has to make clear its own position, and of course its position will be clear. It stands on the side of the black folk in their struggle. But that does not mean that it is going to lecture workers about black and white unite and fight. Rather, the task is to allow the discussion and the conflict and the tensions and the antagonisms to unfold and develop with the confidence that when they play themselves out. I'm reminded a little bit, this is the first time I ever thought about this, I'm reminded a little bit of Obama's speech on race, right, when he was campaigning, in which he spoke quite eloquently, understood the problems and the feelings of black people, also understood the problems and the feelings of white Americans. And I think that speech, in which he honestly reflected on feelings of millions of people in the United States, won for him a tremendous amount of popularity. The problem is, of course, his own position is not clear politically. That is to say, his own programs, what flows from that. But certainly people responded to, for the first time, somebody on a public scale expressing an appreciation of the different sentiments historically developed of black and white Americans. Now, see, James's argument is that the new society exists and that it carries within itself much of the sores and diseases of the old. And therefore, the task of organization is not to develop schemes for the new society, but rather to help it emerge, clarify itself, become more conscious of its development. Now, I recall once in a factory, a group of workers walking out in response to a plant temperature of 100 degrees plus with no fans. Now, we had a little group built in the factory, and we were schooled in the teachings of James, and we understood that walkout represented a way of dealing with grievances outside of the whole management union contract system. So we began to push for the formation of a meeting, calling of a meeting, to discuss ways of developing that little motion so that it was not sucked into the union apparatus, but rather began the process of developing independent organization. Another example from personal experience. I once worked the midnight shift in a metalworking plant. There were two others in the department on that shift, Jimmy and Maurice. Maurice had been having money troubles, which caused him to drink more than he should, which led to him missing days, which caused him trouble on the job, which caused him more trouble at home, which therefore led to him doing more drinking, and I'm sure you can understand the whole cycle. Well, I was off work one night, and I came to work the next night, and Jimmy told me that Maurice had brought a pistol to the plant the night before, planning to shoot the general foreman if he reprimanded him in the morning about his attendance. Did you try to stop him? I asked. No, what for? Well, what happened? I said, well, when the foreman came in, he just said hello and kept going to his office. He doesn't know how close he came to dying. Now, see, I did not want Maurice to shoot the general foreman because I did not want Maurice to spend the rest of his life in prison for blowing away an individual who was no worse than, the general run of his kind. Jimmy looked at the matter differently. For him and for Maurice, Maurice's life was already a prison that could be salvaged by one dramatic no, regardless of the consequences. Who was right? Well, I had read all the books, and I knew that 99 times out of 100, nothing would come of Maurice's action. The plant guards or the cops would take him away or shoot him dead right on the spot. But on the 100th time, something different might happen. The workers would block the plant guards, fight the cops, and the next thing you knew, you had a mutiny on the battleship Potemkin. The new society is the product of these two kinds of knowledge, Jimmy's and mine, and neither could substitute for the other. As a person who had decided to devote his life to making revolution, my job was to recognize and record the new society as it made its appearance, not give lectures to the workers on what they should or should not do. In 1969, a black worker at a Los Angeles aircraft plant, Isaac Jernigan, who had been harassed by management and union and then fired for organizing black workers, brought a gun to work and killed a foreman. Then he went to the union hall and killed 2 union officials. Well, we had a little group in Chicago, and we published a flyer calling for workers to rally to his defense, contribute to his legal campaign, and so forth. Well, not much came of our effort. Until the League of Revolutionary Black Workers in Detroit reprinted our flyer in their newspaper. A Chrysler worker, James Johnson, responding to a history of unfair treatment similar to that faced by Ike Jernigan in Los Angeles, killed 2 foremen in a job center, and then was escorted from the plant carrying a flyer saying, "Long live Ike Jernigan." The League of Revolutionary Black Workers waged a mass campaign on James Johnson's behalf, which included rallies on the courthouse steps, mass demonstrations, while carrying out a courtroom defense based on a plea of temporary insanity. The high point of the trial came when the jury was led on a tour through Chrysler. It found for the defense, concluding that working at Chrysler was indeed enough to drive a person insane. This was Detroit, and many people already knew that to be true. Johnson was acquitted and sent to a mental hospital instead of to prison. As an added insult, Chrysler was ordered to pay him workman's comp. And by the way, I think I recently read, by the way, that he was out now, that James is out, free to carry on the struggle for liberation. The task of revolutionaries is not to organize the workers, but to organize themselves, to discover those patterns of activity and forms of organization that have sprung up out of the struggle and that embody the new society, to clarify those forms and patterns from the other forms and patterns that also exist within the mass movement that reproduce the continuing subordination of people to capital, and to help the revolutionary forms grow stronger, more confident, and more conscious of their direction. It is an essential contribution to the society of disciplined spontaneity, which for James was the definition of the New World. Thank you. Now let's see how I get on.
Thanks for tuning in, folks, and we're going to hope to hear from you next time.
Singing